together. Today, as you know, Jeffrey Herf will be speaking. The title of his talk is Nazi Propaganda in and Towards the Middle East During the Second World War and the Holocaust. Professor Herf is from the Department of History at the University of Maryland. He studies the intersection of ideas and politics in modern European history, and is a specialist in 20th century Germany. He is and has been a fellow of the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, the American Academy in Berlin, the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, the German Marshall Fund, the German Academic Exchange Service, and also the Fulbright program. So his list of acclaim and accomplishments is at an extraordinarily eminent level. He has a new book that's coming out with Yale University Press in 2009. The title will be Nazi Propaganda in the Arab Lands. And Annette and I and others had the privilege of hearing a talk that Professor Herf gave at the U.S. Holocaust Museum over the summer on this issue, which was very impressive, and it's an honor that you're here. And I also had the privilege, and I think I just plugged this in as well, of being on panels with you in Berlin and Vienna, part of a similar program dealing with the bomb and the threat of nuclearized Iran. And I think that the title, the lecture today, is connected to the exporting of European and Nazi anti-Semitism to the Middle East. And this is an area that's been, I think, understudied and extraordinarily important historically, and unfortunately, is very relevant today to understand the connection between European anti-Semitism and how it was exported to the Middle East, and perhaps in a globalizing world, how these ideas and symbols and messages are returning to Europe on a global level, and the threat and the rise of anti-Semitism today and the processes associated to it really need to be understood. And Professor Herf is really at the cutting edge of understanding the history and the contemporary relevant and important, if not crucial, issues. So it's really an honor that you're here.
Thank you, Charles. And it is a pleasure and honor to be here again. I've spoken to Yale a couple times. You all recall that Hannah Arendt described anti-Semitism as an outrage to common sense, and I think there's something infuriating about the fact that there has to be a Yale initiative for the interdisciplinary study of anti-Semitism in 2009. Infuriating because we had hoped that this would be a subject of interest to historians alone, and unfortunately, it's not of interest to historians alone. You all, maybe many of you saw this morning in the New York Times about a former Nazi who found refuge in Egypt, but there was something else in the last week that attracted my attention. I get emails from Memory, the translation service from the Middle East, and perhaps some of you read this item of January 30th, a speech which you can see on video, by the way, by Sheikh Yusuf al-Qadari, and this is what he said this on January 30th. Throughout history, Allah has imposed upon the Jews people who would punish them for their corruption. The last punishment was carried out by Hitler. By means of all the things he did to them, even though they exaggerated this issue, he managed to put them in their place. This was divine punishment for them. Allah willing, the next time will be at the hand of the believers. Now, that quote struck me as particularly interesting because it wasn't the first time that I had come across the idea that Allah had sent a messenger to earth to punish the Jews. It was articulated by the Islamist intellectual Said Qutb in his essay, Our Struggle with the Jews, in 1950, and in 1943 and 1944, it was an idea that percolated in Heinrich Himmler's Reichssicherheitshauptamt, the Reich Security Main Office, and led to a leaflet produced in about that the Nazis distributed in the Middle East that was about the that presented Hitler as a messenger from Allah, who was there to punish the Jews. So the lineages of these ideas remain to be explored. But the book Nazi Propaganda in the Arab Lands, 1939 to 1945, which I'm delighted to say will be published by Yale this coming fall, is about the diffusion of Nazi ideology to the Middle East in print and on shortwave radio during World War II. And this broad question about anti-Semitism's afterlife is one that a younger generation of historians who read Arabic will, I hope, engage in the years to come. This outrage to common sense, which should have been consigned to the past, had an afterlife outside of Europe. And the question is, what contribution did National Socialism make to this afterlife? I want to speak most of 40 minutes, leaving time for discussion, so I'll proceed. During World War II and the Holocaust, the Nazi regime engaged in an intensive effort to appeal to Arabs and Muslims in the Middle East and North Africa. It did so both by presenting the Nazi regime as a champion of secular anti-imperialism, especially against Britain, as well as by a selective appropriation and reception of the traditions of Islam in ways that suggested that they were compatible with the ideology of National Socialism. In this project from which this talk draws, I am basing my work on archival findings that make it possible to expand our knowledge of this effort by the Third Reich. In so doing, this pushes the history of Nazism beyond its Eurocentric limits, while pointing to the European dimensions of Arabic and Islamic radicalism in the mid-20th century. On shortwave radio and in printed items distributed in the millions, Nazi Germany's Arabic language propaganda leapt across the seemingly insurmountable barriers created by the ideology of Aryan racial superiority. From the fall of 1939 to March of 1945, the regime broadcast shortwave Arabic programs to the Middle East and North Africa 7 days and nights a week. The broadcasts were actually well known at the time. The preponderance of its, though they were known at the time, the preponderance of its print and radio propaganda has not previously been documented and examined, nor has it entered into the intellectual and cultural and political history of Nazism. In the light of new archival findings, which I'll discuss in a moment, we are now able to present a much fuller picture of the wartime propaganda. In the course of this effort, officials of the Nazi regime, especially members of the Foreign Office and Himmler's SS, but especially the Foreign Office, worked closely with pro-Nazi Arab exiles in Berlin to adapt general propaganda themes aimed at the German and European audience to the religious traditions of Islam and the regional and local political realities of the Middle East and North Africa. This adaptation was the product of a political and ideological collaboration involving the Foreign Ministry, but also the intelligence services, the propaganda ministry, the SS, and the pro-Nazi Arab exiles in wartime Berlin. And so we drew on a confluence of perceived shared political interests in opposing Britain and the Jews and then the United States, as well as a cultural fusion, borrowing and interacting between Nazi ideology and certain strands of Arab nationalism and Islamic religious traditions. In wartime Berlin, radical anti-Semitism of European and German-speaking provenance found a common ground with radical anti-Semitism rooted in Quranic verses and the commentaries on them. Just as Nazi anti-Semitism was a radicalization of already existing elements in European culture, so the anti-Semitism of the pro-Nazi Arab exiles resulted from a radicalization of already existing elements within the traditions of Islam. European historians would not assume to discuss Nazism as if it had nothing to do with the history of Europe And so the history of radical Islam also cannot be discussed as if it has nothing to do with the history of Islam as well. What's good for Europe is good for the world of Islam, no more, no less. In Berlin, the officials in the regime, as well as the exiles, participated in a process of selective appropriation of past traditions, and they found a common ground, I think somewhat to their surprise, which produced texts and broadcasts that accompanied the Axis military and political propaganda offensives in North Africa and the Middle East. So I want to emphasize that this is a story about things that intellectuals often do. That is, they selectively appropriate the past, just as the Germans selectively appropriated past European traditions. So the Arab exiles in Berlin, about whom more in a moment, selectively appropriated their own past traditions. This is a chapter in what we'd call a dark chapter, or a grim chapter in the history of hybridity or transnationalism or globalization. We know that when people from different cultures interact with one another, they sometimes bring about mutual understanding and peace and all good things. But what happened in this situation was that when these two met, they brought out the worst in each other's civilizations, accentuated it, and the result was a diffusion of anti-Semitism outside of its European context. Now, how the Nazis understood that they had a problem in appealing to Arabs and Muslims. And the problem was called Adolf Hitler in his book Mein Kampf. Because for those of you who have read the sections of Mein Kampf that deal, the short sections that deal with Arabs, Hitler there expresses conventional racist attitudes towards the Egyptians, towards Arabs, and expresses a kind of conventional Aryan superiority toward these non-European peoples. This was a problem for the Foreign Office, a serious problem. There were translations of Mein Kampf into Arabic, and the Foreign Office officials who were involved with some of them made efforts to delete those sections of the book in which his disdain was expressed. But there was a bit of a surprise that both Hitler experienced and some of the officials of the regime, when they understood that the entry point into the Arab and Islamic world was not primarily through the protocols of the Elders of Zion or through Mein Kampf or conventional Nazi ideology, which after all was about the domestic politics, the local politics of Germany and Austria, about things that Arabs and in the Middle East had scant interest in. Rather, the entry point was the Quran. And that the selective reading of the Quran and the commentaries on the Quran. I'm going to skip, I'll just mention very briefly here. There's a classic work that is the founding work on this subject by the Polish historian Lucas Harasowicz called The Third Reich and the Arab East, which he published in 1966. In 2006, two German historians, Klaus Michael Malmann and Martin Coopers, published Habmond und Hakenkreuz, Das Dritte Reich, die Araber und Palästina, Crescent and Swastika, the Third Reich, the Arabs and Palestine, which is a path-breaking book based upon new research both in the Foreign Office archives in Berlin and also in the German military archives. And what Malmann and Cooper demonstrated was that the propaganda that I'm going to be discussing was not only of interest to the intellectual and cultural historian, but it was intimately connected to the conduct of the war. That Harasowicz understood in 1966. But what Malmann and Coopers also pointed out to us was that this propaganda was also part of an attempt to extend the final solution of the Jewish question to North Africa and the the Middle East. You are all familiar with the Wannsee Conference and the protocols of the Wannsee Conference, and you may recall there's a peculiarity about numbers, with especially numbers regarding the numbers of Jews supposedly in France, which is given as 700,000. But there weren't 700,000 Jews in France, there were 300,000, or 400,000, not Jews. Anyway, there are about 300,000 or 400,000 Jews that are not accounted for, and they were in North Africa. And so the Wannsee Conference protocol actually implies it is a protocol that telegraphs Hitler's determination to extend the Holocaust to North Africa, to the Jews, the 700,000 Jews actually, who lived in North Africa and the Middle East. And so a great deal hung on the outcome of the Battle of Al Alamein and the adventures of General Rommel and the Panzer Army in North Africa. Had the Germans won the Battle of Al Alamein, there was nothing standing between them and Cairo and then Palestine. And if Malman and Cooper then point out, if that had happened, there was an Einsatzgruppe led by Walter Rauf that was prepared to travel to the Middle East and begin to engage in the kind of operations in the Middle East that the Einsatzgruppen were engaging in on the Eastern Front. So this is important, recent scholarship that adds a dimension to the history of propaganda. Now, as many of you know, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, Hajj Amin al-Husseini, was famous at the time and has bulked large in the discussion of all of these issues. The mutual admiration between Husseini and Hitler is a matter of public record, and so is his virulent hatred of the Jews. Moreover, details of his collaboration with Heinrich Himmler and his knowledge of the Holocaust have also been in the public record for a long time. Husseini was a key figure in finding common ground between the ideology of Nazism and that of Arab nationalism, as well as the doctrines of militant Islam. But while the Mufti was a key figure in this historical episode, so too were many German intelligence officers, diplomats, military officers, members of the German Foreign Ministry, and its political division, which included Office 7, that was the Rundfunkpolitische Abteilung, the Office of Political Radio. The broadcasts that came out of the Office of Political Radio in Arabic were the result of a cooperative effort between the German officials working there, and this is Joachim von Ribbentrop's foreign ministry. They had occasional assistance from Joseph Goebbels' propaganda ministry, but Hitler had decided that the foreign ministry, not the propaganda ministry, would be the center of foreign language propaganda. And they received assistance from Orientalists in the cultural division in Heinrich Himmler's Reich Security main office, and from German Orientalists who advised the foreign ministry. But the pro-Nazi Arab exiles gave the Germans something that they had not had before in such abundance, namely native Arabic speakers and readers who could make Nazism's message understandable in fluent, colloquial Arabic to the residents of North Africa and the Middle East. The shortwave, this region in the 1930s and 40s was a region with about 80% rates of illiteracy. So the radio was a particularly important means of political communication. The United States Office of War Information in August of 1941 estimated there were about 55,000 shortwave radios in Egypt, 4,000 in Iraq, 24,000 in Palestine, 6,000 in Syria. Radios were listened to in homes, of course, but also in cafes and in public places, and listening became a kind of collective experience. So the radio was crucial. Between 1940 and 43, the Germans had forces in North Africa, in Libya, in Morocco, and there they had propaganda units which produced printed materials that I'll talk about a little bit. But the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, also dropped printed materials. They had special kind of balloon, parachute kind of devices that dropped leaflets. But after 1943, when the Germans were defeated in Tunisia, they had no presence, no military presence in the region, and so shortwave radio was particularly important in the last 2 years of the war. Now, in the American embassy in Berlin in 1939 and 1940, the United States was blessed with having a particularly insightful charge d'affaires. Now, those of you who have written or read much about the Holocaust may be familiar with the name Alexander Kirk. Alexander Kirk was a charge d'affaires in Berlin, and he wrote some of the most important memos sent back to Washington about anti-Jewish persecution of the Nazi regime. In 1941, Alexander Kirk became the head of the American legation and then became the American ambassador of the United States to Egypt. And he remained in that position until the spring of 1944. Kirk was aware that the Nazi regime was broadcasting in Arabic to the region, and began to write summaries and memos back to Cordell Hull, the Secretary of State, sending to the Office of the Secretary of State. In these the summaries, he realized that the broadcasts were important, the summaries continued and they expanded in length and detail until April 1942, when he had gathered a staff. I don't know who was on the staff. The names and the files are not there, but the staff must have included native Arabic speakers. It included people able to translate between Arabic and English, stenographers. The tape recorder was not yet invented. The Germans had invented the tape recorder, but the Americans didn't have tape recorders in Cairo. And so Kirk's staff began a remarkable enterprise. From the spring of 1941 until the spring of 1945, they produced verbatim, not summaries. Maybe some of you have seen the Foreign Broadcast Information Service summaries of radio and television and newspaper broadcasts all around the world. The FBIS it's a fantastic resource for research. But Kirk produced verbatim English language transcripts that he sent back to Washington in reports called Axis Broadcasts in Arabic every week for the remainder of the war, about 150 reports. Each report could be between 10 and 30 pages. The result is maybe 3,000 pages. These were declassified in the files of the American Embassy, in the State Department files in the National Archives in Washington, which are a mile from my office at the University of Maryland. They were declassified in 1977. Now, the National Archives, unlike some of the archives that you may have worked in elsewhere, does not have researchers write their name down at the front of a file. So if you're working in a German archive, it's kind of nice to see, oh, now who has been here before me? And that's not the case in the National Archives. You have no idea if anybody has looked at the files before. So I don't know if previous scholars, have looked at the Kirk transcripts, Axis Broadcasts in Arabic, before I did. At any rate, what I know is that I found them in June of 2007. And they are the most extensive record anywhere that I know of Nazi Germany's Arabic language propaganda offensive. Now, I want to summarize, and I will be drawing on them in just a few moments. These files are an indispensable source of examination for Nazism's efforts to extend its appeals to Arab and Muslim societies. They've been declassified since 1977. Why somebody didn't come across them earlier is an interesting question. Now, I'm going to summarize this section, and we can talk about it in discussion if you want. In 1936, the captain of the Egyptian Olympic team had been reading reports in the Egyptian press about the Nuremberg race laws. And he he spoke to the Egyptian diplomats and said, if the Germans want to distinguish between Aryans and non-Aryans, and they think that non-Aryans are inferior to Aryans, then I think that the Egyptian athletes really shouldn't go to the Olympics. If that's what they think of us, we're not going to go. And this led to intense, and then there were other problems. Egyptian husbands were saying, oh, you mean I have to divorce my German wife because I'm not Aryan? Or Egyptian women, wives were saying, I have got to. And so there were high-ranking officials who met in Berlin to discuss the burning question of whether Egyptians, Lebanese, Syrians, Iraqis, Palestinians, Arabs are members of the Aryan race. Are they members of the Aryan race? And what is the meaning of anti-Semitism? Now, the conventional understanding of anti-Semitism before the meetings took place was it's a very broad meaning, very broad understanding. Anti-Semitism applies to Semites. And who are Semites? Well, some of them are Jews, but some of them are Egyptians, and some of them are Iraqis, and they're Semitic peoples from the area. Well, the result of these meetings was no, that is not what we mean. We have a narrow understanding. In fact, the Nuremberg race laws are not about Aryans and non-Aryans. They're about Germans and Jews. About Germans and Jews. They're not about Semites. So we are not, in fact, anti-Semites. The Nazi regime is not an anti-Semitic regime. The Nazi regime, the diplomats argued, and the officials of the racial political office, the Nazi regime is an anti-Jewish regime. It's not an anti-Semitic regime. And then that message was communicated to the diplomats from Egypt and Iraq and other countries, and they said, oh, I see, you're not an anti-Semitic regime, and you're an anti-Jewish regime. Aha, okay, well then we'll send the boys and girls to the Olympics. And this intellectual, ideological clarification of 1935-36 was very important because the paradox, it's very easy to imagine how Lenin would have appealed to the international working class, or how communists would have a universal message, or the United States is a universalist democratic message. But the problem of an officially racist government is, how do you find any friends? You know, if you think you're superior to everybody in the world, how are you going to find any friends and allies? And so this clarification of the mid-30s was very important for laying the groundwork for reaching out. So, okay, the propaganda, the broadcast began in Germany in 1939. The Italians began in 1934, but the Germans began in 1939. And the staff that was working on the early, what we'll call the early broadcasts, was led by a man named Kurt Munzel. And Munzel was a diplomat. He had worked in the Dresdner Bank in Cairo in the 1930s. He learned Arabic. He became familiar with the region. And by 1942, he had a staff of 19 people, which appears to have been composed of 7 Arabic speakers. And with this staff, he was he began broadcasting, writing and sending Arabic language broadcasts. Now, these early broadcasts have the tone of a sympathetic, well-informed, politically engaged scholar who is eager to please, but not quite able to pick up the ins and outs and the idioms of local politics. But the early broadcast sent a clear message, and it was that the Nazi regime was not celebrating the superiority of the Aryan race over inferior Middle Eastern Semites. It was a friend to Arab nationalists and Muslims. Here, for example, on December 3rd, 1940, the Munzel Orient Office broadcast a paper about the English occupation of Egypt. Each of the broadcasts began with the incantation of Deutsch, O Mohammedaner, O Muslims. Not O Arabs, but O Mohammedaner, O Muslims. And I will read some examples, some of the text. O God's servants, Above all the other commandments, none is more important to the Muslims than piety. For piety is the core of all virtues and the bond of all honorable human characteristics. Muslims, you are now backward, because you have not shown God the proper piety, and you do not fear him. You do things that are not commanded, and you leave to the side things that are. God has proven to be true, and you are now the humiliated ones in your own country. And this has come about because you don't have piety and fear of God, as your pious forefathers did. Of them one can say they are strong against the unbelievers and merciful among themselves. O Muslims, direct your gaze to the Holy Quran and the tradition of the prophets. Then you will see that Islamic law is driven by piety toward God and fear of his punishment. Read, for example, the words, O believers, be pious and do not die without being a Muslim. Stand by God and don't be divided. This was over Nazi radio. Now, the point of this and other broadcasts was that there was an elective affinity between National Socialist ideology and its understanding of what Islam was, which had to do with piety, obedience, community, unity, rather than skepticism, individualism, and division. The broadcast presented Nazi Germany as an example of a society that had been divided, that had been weak, that had been humiliated and oppressed by the horrible British and French after the First World War, and yet had reunified and found common purpose and a kind of community, and that this was an example that the Arab world should follow. Such broadcasts then were followed very quickly in the same evening by appeals to Arab nationalism and the struggle for freedom and independence against the British colonialism. So a kind of Nazi anti-imperialism was a very important component of these talks. Now, there was a limit to the effectiveness of these talks. A sympathetic, well-engaged scholar didn't have the ability to get to talk effectively about the ins and outs of local politics. And that's where Haj Amin al-Husseini and Rashid al-Gilani. Rashid al-Gilani was an Iraqi politician who participated in a coup in April of 1941. The coup was supported by Nazi Germany and fascist Italy. The Gilani government was in power until late May of 1941, when Britain invaded, first in Basra, and then drove to Baghdad, overthrew the Gilani government, and Gilani and Husseini, who participated in the coup, fled first to Tehran, then with assistance from the Germans and the Italians, went from Tehran to Ankara, and then from Ankara to Rome, and then in November of 1941 to Berlin. Now this too is famous, and perhaps many of you are familiar with the famous meeting of November 28th of 1941 between Hitler and Husseini. The pictures went around the world. Hitler heard Husseini lavish praise on him, expressed support for Nazi Germany in the war, and urged Germany and Italy to issue a declaration in support of Arab independence. Hitler promised Husseini that after the German armies were successful in the Caucasus and after they defeated the Red Army in the southern part of the Soviet Union, the German armies would then drive south from the Caucasus into the Middle East. And at that point, it would be the proper moment to declare support for Arab independence from Britain and France. And also, it was at that point that Hitler told Husseini on November 28th of 1941 that he would give the Arab world the assurance that its hour of liberation had arrived, and Germany's objective would then be solely the destruction of the Jewish element residing in the Arab sphere under the protection of British power. In other words, the November 28th, 1941 meeting, and those of you who know Christopher Browning, Richard Reitman, and Saul Friedlander's work on the fall of 1941 know that many, many decisions had been taken from between the spring and the summer and the fall of 1941 to launch the Holocaust. The meeting, the significance of the Hitler-Husseini meeting is that Hitler is telling him, is assuring him of that the final solution of the Jewish question in Europe will encompass also the extension of the final solution to the Middle East, if the military events made that possible. Now, in the spring and summer of 1942, Rommel's Africa Corps had advanced to a point within 60 miles of Alexandria, Egypt, and Nazi Germany's leaders thought that victory in North Africa might be in their grasp. Hitler and Mussolini then decided to issue the public declaration in support of independence. On July 3rd of 1942, the Berlin-based Berlin in Arabic station announced that Germany and Italy resolved that the troops of the Axis powers are victoriously advancing into Egyptian territory to guarantee Egypt's independence and sovereignty. They were there to liberate the whole of the Near East from the British yoke. Their policy was Egypt for the Egyptians. Husseini then was heard on the radio referring to the glorious victory secured by Axis troops in North Africa, and has encouraged the Arabs in the whole East and filled their hearts with admiration for Marshal Rommel's genius and the bravery of Axis soldiers. This is because the Arabs believe that the Axis powers are fighting against the common enemy, namely the British and the Jews. Now, a key component of Nazi propaganda in Germany and in Europe, and I made this argument in The Jewish Enemy, a key component was to reassure the German people that because international Jewry had launched a war of genocidal proportions to exterminate the Germans, that the German government was coming to the defense of the German people and exterminating the Jews of Europe instead. And that the government was doing this. The people could be rest assured that the government was taking matters into its hands and retaliating against the war of genocidal proportions that the Jews in Moscow and London and Washington had launched to exterminate the Germans. The message that came across to the Middle East was a little different. It instead was a plea for the listeners to take matters into their own hands. On July 7th of 1942, the Americans recorded one of the most inflammatory broadcasts of the Second World War in Arabic propaganda to that point. The station called the Voice of Free Arabism, Die Stimme Freie Arabitum, was entitled, Kill the Jews Before They Kill You. It was a statement that equaled that of Hitler and Goebbels in its anti-Semitic radicalism. It began with a lie, namely that a large number of Jews resided in Egypt and a number of Poles, Greeks, Armenians, and the Free French, people who had fled from Europe to find refuge in Egypt, had been issued with revolvers and ammunition to help them against the Egyptians at the last moment when Britain is forced to evacuate Egypt. And I'm going to read parts of the statement because it's unpleasant. In the face of this barbaric procedure by the British, we think it best, if the life of the Egyptian nation is to be saved, that the Egyptians rise as one man to kill the Jews before they have a chance of betraying the Egyptian people. It's the duty of the Egyptians to annihilate the Jews and destroy their property. Egypt can never forget that it's the Jews who are carrying out Britain's imperialist policies in the Arab countries, and they are the source of all the disasters which have befallen the countries of the East. It goes on about the Jews. The Jews are seeking to extend their domination throughout the region. You must kill the Jews before they open fire on you. Arabs of Syria, Iraq, and Palestine, what are you waiting for? The Jews are planning to violate your women, to kill your children, and to destroy you. Your sole hope of salvation lies in annihilating the Jews before they annihilate you. Now, this statement is the identical logical projection and paranoia that was the defining feature of radical anti-Semitism on the continent, in the European continent, and it was impossible to be more blunt. It was unusual in the extent to which it voiced genocidal threats that were more implicit in many other assertions about the venality and the power of the Jews. I repeat, while the anti-Semitic propaganda of the regime in Germany assured readers and listeners that the regime was making good on Hitler's public threats to exterminate and annihilate the Jews, the Arabic language propaganda took an even further step in incitement to anti-Jewish violence in its clear appeal for audience participation. And leaders take matters into their own hands. You may recall during the Rwandan genocide, a number of journalists wrote that this was the first time that radio had been used to incite people to mass murder. Well, it was not the first time. Otto Dietrich, the director of the Reich Press Office, in fact, was brought to trial and convicted after in one of the Nuremberg successor trials of incitement and crimes against humanity for his role in the radio programs within Germany. Nobody was brought to trial, more about that later, on charges of incitement. And if you hear at Yale, the Nuremberg Project website, this wonderful project indicates, you can look at the genocide, UN Genocide Convention there, and you'll see that Article 3 describes broadcasts like this as a crime against humanity, rather, I'm sorry, as part of the crime of genocide, because it is incitement qualities. Now, Kirk sent a mixture of verbatim transcripts and summaries, and he understood the mix of secular and religious appeals coming from the Axis. Here's one report. Before Islam, the Arabs had been divided against themselves. When Muhammad united them, they overthrew the Persians, Romans, and Jews. Now they can overthrow the British, Russians, and Americans. Now they would be led by the great leaders, the Mufti and Kilani. Only traitors to Islam would support Britain and the Allies. An Axis victory in the Middle East would be a bad day for traitors when the victorious and righteous liberators of Islam arrived, assisted by a widespread revolt throughout the entire Middle East. Kirk wrote, Axis radio attacked the Jews ad nauseum, claiming the Jews, backed by Britain and the USA, were the arch enemies of Islam. They controlled American finance, and they forced Roosevelt to pursue a policy of aggression. In Germany, German anti-Semitic propaganda created a set of usual suspects: Felix Frankfurter, Bernard Baruch, Herbert Lehman, Saul Bloom, and of course Franklin, the Jewish power, the cabal behind Franklin Roosevelt. This cabal appeared in the Arabic language propaganda as well, but there was another figure, in addition to Roosevelt, who became the main hate object, the name and face of the Jewish threat to Islam and the Arab world, and that was Chaim Weizmann. And the propaganda denounced Weizmann again and again. It is very important to understand that from the beginning of the Nazi regime to its very last days, it was emphatically and always opposed to Zionism. It never supported Zionism. It supported immigration of German Jews to Palestine. But again and again, on the radio, it denounced Zionism as an expression of Jewish imperialism, an attempt to dominate the entire region, at times to wipe out Islam and to destroy the Arab countries. It held the Allies responsible. It held the Americans responsible for assisting the Jews. Every time that Churchill or Roosevelt or any Allied leader made any remark at all about the persecution of the Jews in Europe, the Nazi propaganda response was to say, you see, the Jews control them. One problem that the Foreign Office recognized by 1942 was that in the following. It had no difficulty inciting, or rather encouraging, anger at Britain in the Arab world. Britain had been a colonial power, and Nazi propaganda, the Nazi propagandists thought that they were having oh my goodness, okay, lots to say, a lot to say about what was wrong with Britain. But the problem was that the Arabs didn't despise the United States. So how could Nazi propaganda shift from its anti-British theme to anti-American themes? And the argument that was made was to link the United States to Zionism. more the United States could be identified with Zionism, the more the Germans felt they could connect anger over Zionism to anger at the United States. The response of the Office of War Information in the United States was to argue that American political warfare, American counter-propaganda, should not mention Zionism at all. Don't talk about the Jewish issue. This is a loser for us. Husseini, in summarizing a great deal here, on November 5th of 1943, Voice of Free Arabism reported on Husseini's speech in Berlin to all the Muslims of Germany and Europe, which was to protest the Balfour Declaration. And the importance of that speech and a great deal of other broadcasts was that Husseini rooted his hostility to the Jews, not only in the conflicts between Arabs and Jews in Palestine, but that this was an age-old conflict that went back to the origins of Islam, and that there was an ineradicable conflict and hostility between the Jews and Muslims. It could not be compromised out of existence. And for him, there was the very existence of Islam and of Judaism meant that they were involved in an ineradicable enmity. Enmity has always existed between Arab and Jew since ancient times, but it has been accentuated since the appearance of Islam. In Islam, the Jews found a danger to their beliefs. They fought the Prophet and his followers, and when they found that the Muslims were gaining strength, they intrigued among them. So the Husseini, as in the last years of the war and the broadcast, predicted dire consequences for Arabs and Muslims if the Axis won the war, if the Allies won the war. If the Allies won the war, a victory for the United States and Britain and the Soviet Union would be a victory for the Jews. Whereas if the Axis won the war, this would be a victory for the Arabs and for Islam. The OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, in the summer of 1945, was asked by Justice Robert Jackson, who was preparing the Nuremberg trials, to examine the response in the Middle East to possible war crimes prosecutions of those Arabs who had sided with the Nazis. And the conclusion was that there was no support anywhere in the region for these people because they were perceived as being involved in a struggle against British imperialism. Husseini was able to get out. He had been arrested, and then through never fully clarified circumstances, he was able to get out of France, and he came to Cairo in 1946. When he did, Hassan al-Banna, the head of the Muslim Brotherhood, made a public statement about Husseini. And the American embassy translated it and sent it back to Washington. The Muslim Brotherhood and all Arabs request declared that the Mufti is welcome to stay in any Arab country he may choose. The hearts of the Arabs are palpitated with joy at hearing that he has reached an Arab country. What a hero, what a miracle of a man. Yes, this hero who challenged an empire and fought Zionism with the help of Hitler and Germany. Germany and Hitler are gone. But Amin al-Husseini will continue the struggle. God entrusted him with a mission, and he must succeed. The Lord Almighty did not preserve Amin for nothing. There must be a divine purpose behind the preservation of the life of this man, namely the defeat of Zionism. Amin, march on. God is with you. We are behind you. We are willing to sacrifice our necks for the cause. To death, forward march. Now, a plausible reading of al-Banna's statement would be that Haj Amin al-Husseini was continuing the same struggle that Hitler in Germany, as well as Husseini himself, had been waging during World War II. For al-Banna, the war and its themes were to be continued in the Middle East, and if so, who better to play a leading role than a political and religious leader with experience in fighting the Jewish enemy in Europe. So far from criticizing him for having sided with Germany and Hitler, al-Banna expressed admiration for Husseini's wartime activities. In wartime Cairo, al-Banna and members of the Brotherhood would have been able to hear what Husseini and others on Access Radio had to say about the Jews and the Allies. He found these words admirable. Moreover, Husseini's survival, escape, and arrival in Cairo were proof, in al-Banna's view, that God approved as well. Let me just read, I want to come to a conclusion. Let me just read a document, and then I'll say something about concluding nature. In 1943, by 1943, Husseini had developed a relationship, a friendship, but a relationship with Heinrich Himmler. And Himmler was fascinated with the possibilities of an elective affinity between his understanding of Islam and National Socialism. And so he asked his officials in Berlin and at the University of Tübingen to see if there would be some way of presenting Hitler in an Islamic context. And the first proposal was to present Hitler as the Mahdi. And the conclusion was, well, this won't work because obviously Hitler is not Arabic and nobody will believe it and we will be laughed at. So how stupid do you think we are? Then the further research developed the possibility that Hitler could be presented as an agent of Allah who returns to earth to punish the Jews. And this text was produced and then turned into an Arabic leaflet which was distributed by the Germans. We know that the Antichrist will appear at the end of days, and he will enter and deceive. And this time there will be a time of great oppression for the believers. O Arabs, have you seen the time of the Antichrist has come? Do you know? This fat, curly-haired Jew that deceives the whole world and who lords over the whole world and steals the lands of the Arabs, he is the ally of the devil. We know that the kingdom of the Antichrist is not eternal. Abdallah bin Masri al-Bidawi said that God sends his servant, and he will kill the Antichrist with his lance and fight his palaces. O Arabs, do you know the servant of God? He has appeared in the world and turned his spear against the Antichrist and his allies, and he has injured them deeply, and he will kill the Antichrist, as it is written, and will fight his palaces, and his allies will fall into hell. Now, in addition to the above effort to identify Hitler as God's servant, now on earth, to kill the Antichrist, the Reichssicherheitshauptamt also intended to distribute a series of photos showing Husseini with Bosnian Muslim soldiers through its network of agents in Syria, Iraq, and Palestine. This is perhaps part of the prehistory of that address that was made on January 30th last week. But the larger point here is that I'm presenting what I hope is an agenda for historians who do read Arabic and who can do the other side of what I'm presenting, who can tell us about the reception of these ideas. What I've been able to demonstrate more extensively than has been previously done is that the Nazi regime and its officials found a way of making cultural connection to the world of Arab nationalism and radical Islam. And that this is one chapter in explaining what I mentioned at the outset, this infuriating phenomenon that we are experiencing, namely that anti-Semitism, which was discredited and buried, dead as a major political tradition in Europe in 1945, had experienced an afterlife in this very different cultural context. Thank you.
We'll do a Q&A session now, and
yeah, thank you very much for this interesting and enlightening.
Can't hear you.
Yeah, I try to speak a bit louder. Actually, I have kind of three different questions. First, and I apologize, I do not know the name of the author. From 1937, a Swiss Catholic writer, I think his name is Alexander. He wrote an important book, and I read it maybe 10 years ago, and I wanted to make something about it. I didn't. He was making a claim in 1937 that Hitler is a kind of new Muhammad, that there is a kind of relationship of National Socialism and Islam. It was 1937, maybe you heard about it. It's in German, but I think it's an interesting piece because it was before the Holocaust and a lot of stuff. Second question is about the impact of the Arabic radio broadcasting. I'm wondering if there might maybe some cultural or philosophy courses inside, and maybe if they refer to Heidegger, because at that time, of course, he was one of the most important German philosophers. And I just read a PhD from a Egyptian scholar. He made a PhD in Berlin some years ago, and he was dealing with Muslim Dasein or something like this. So I'm wondering, because I can't read his Arabic sources, maybe there is something also in the radio at that time would be interesting. And third question would be, there has been a kind of psychological warfare or anti-warfare department of the US Army, and Peter Viereck, who wrote his Pulitzer Prize-winning famous American intellectual who died 2 years ago, he made a PhD in 1941 dealing with metapolitics and German nationalism and all those stuff, and afterwards he was working in Italy and North Africa, and especially listening to German radio and making transcripts for the American intelligence service. And I'm wondering if there might be any relationship between, because he was listening to German radio and maybe he was also in relation to Arabic radio, I'm not sure. I think this department was called PMG, I'm not sure. It's a kind of psychological department of the intelligence service. Something, yeah.
That's very interesting. No, I didn't know about a book presenting Hitler and Muhammad, but the Orientalists in Germany would have criticized an effort to do that. For reasons that I just pointed out. Heidegger plays no. He has many sins, but not here. So Heidegger played no role at all in this matter. There was no reference to him. To talk about Martin Heidegger, again, we're talking about radio. We're talking about, why would you talk about Martin Heidegger to people in Egypt or Morocco or Palestine? This means nothing to them. There's no importance whatsoever. What you want to talk about is the local politics, the course of the war. How does all of this affect them? And so it's not, the effectiveness of the propaganda does not involve transferring the idioms and the language and the people and the ideas of Europe to the Middle East. In that sense, it's a matter of connecting to what you see as their cultural traditions. Peter Viereck, I didn't realize that he had worked in the Middle East. The reports of the Office of Strategic Services, of military intelligence, American diplomatic officials in the region are very interesting. And one reason that they're so interesting is that the Americans arrived in the Middle East fully aware of their ignorance. This was just at the moment when the United States was really becoming a world power. The Americans didn't arrive saying, we know everything about this place. They arrived saying, most of us don't know Arabic, we don't know anything about this place. The British, if you read the British files, they're these elegant interpretive essays about what's going on in Egypt. This one says this, and that one says that, this is what it means, and I understand it all, and it's very interesting. The Americans tended to just translate a lot of documents. So for the historian, the American files are in a way more interesting because there's a certain modesty there. We don't really know, so let's just translate a lot of things, and then we'll try and make sense of it. The American intelligence files are a very, very rich. The Americans and the British were convinced that German radio was had an impact. The evidence is not. There were not many audience, surveys. The evidence you get from the archives is impressionistic, but they were sure that the perception that Britain, and especially the United States, was sympathetic to the Jews and sympathetic to Zionism was a serious problem for winning the war in the Middle East. And in 1944, I'm trying to be brief, in 1944, Senator Robert Wagner and several other politicians in Congress proposed that the United States support the immigration of 100,000 Jews to Palestine. And the Pentagon, it wasn't called the Pentagon, the War Department, and the State Department said, no, that's a terrible idea. If the United States is associated with sending 100,000 Jews to Palestine, what do you want to do? Try and lose the war in the Middle East? So, and Roosevelt kept saying, well, wait till after the war, wait till after the war. And even after the war, the War Department and the War Department and the State Department were opposed to the foundation of a Jewish state in Palestine, because they were convinced that it would undermine American interests.
Just to comment on the first question on German Orientalists and a link. I mean, I know. I'm not sure you established a link via Islamic religion.
Sorry, can you talk louder? They can't hear you in the back.
Oh,
sorry.
No, I just wanted to say there's a book coming out 38 or 39 by German Orientalists called Björkman, something about Arabic leadership figures. Do you know that?
I've seen a number of that. Yes, I mean that in particular. Suzanne Marchand at Louisiana State University has a large book coming out. Oh, there's a question about. Well, wait a minute. What is the question? There was a comment. Was there a question lurking in the comment?
No, I just wanted to say, there are several German Orientalists. There's an attempt to sort of look for kind of leadership figures or Führergestalten in the Arabic history, and I don't know who this kind of book was written for, but it might could have been used to establish links between Nazi propaganda in the Middle East.
There is a significant scholarship that has now been done on Orientalists in the Third Reich. And the argument that Susan Marchand has made in a forthcoming book is that generally the discipline of Orientalism in Germany was part of an Enlightenment project and was not a precursor to National Socialism. But that there were, during the Nazi period, there certainly were scholars who were involved in this project to present. But they played a role. But I think what I want to draw more attention to is the daily ongoing cooperation in offices of the Foreign Ministry in Berlin between this entourage around Husseini and Kilani, several hundred people who had fled from the Middle East, driven out of the Middle East by the British, working with officials in the government. With that leaflet, that statement I read at the end, that was a result of cooperation and consultation between the SS and the Forschungsstelle Orient at the University of Tübingen. And there, Walter Wust and some other names will come to mind, worked on this kind of thing.
You're concentrating heavily on the Middle East, Muslims, Arabs, etc. Who were the anti-Semites during the 30s and the 40s?
Where?
All over the world, but let's concentrate on Europe. Who were the anti-Semites in Europe in the 30s and the 40s?
The book is about the Nazi regime.
Which book is that?
This fourth,
What does the book have to do with the question I asked?
I'm going to tell you what it has to do with the
Thank you.
question you asked. Yes. This is, my talk draws on a forthcoming book. And the book is about the efforts of the Nazi regime in Europe to convey its ideas outside of Europe. So it's obvious the Nazi regime in the 1930s.
But the Jews were murdered in Europe. What's this got to do with the Muslim world? I still don't understand the connection. It says here, interdisciplinary study of anti-Semitism.
I will, all right, I'm going to give it one more try and then I'll turn to another question.
Thank you.
Okay. We know a lot about the Holocaust in Europe. We know that we know what the Nazi regime did to the Jews in Europe. The question that I'm interested in is concerns the efforts of the Nazi regime to extend its policies outside Europe. And if you want to write, I published a book in 2006, which is about just what you're talking about.
No, I asked you a question.
You're not listening to me.
I am listening to you.
No,
You're
no,
talking
you're
about
not.
the Muslims.
No, you're not.
You're
You're
talking
not.
about Berlin and the Muslims.
You're not. Well, whether you.
I asked a legitimate question.
He gave you an answer.
I gave you an answer.
And that-
I mean,
You may not like the answer, but
I did not get the answer.
I published a book
Because
just.
during the 30s and the 40s, the entire Christian world, that's right, Jacques Hughes, I'm a Holocaust survivor, and I'm not going to let you get away with it talking about the Middle East when you talk about anti-Semitism. My whole family was murdered, so please, let's stick to the subject.
I'm a scholar, sir. My father was a refugee from Nazi Germany, and in 2009, I don't like you to pull that stuff. I'm
What's
terribly
wrong?
sorry.
What's wrong?
Let me finish. I'm terribly sorry that this happened to your family.
Don't be sorry, just answer
No,
the
I
question.
am. And I've devoted 30 years of my scholarly career to
So
trying to
have I, most of my life.
Here's what I suggest. I published a book in 2006 called The Jewish Enemy, which is about what happened in Europe. And it's all about why what happened in Europe happened in Europe. And as a scholar, I decided to write about something else. There's no point in writing another book about the same thing that I wrote before. So, I understand your sentiments. I share many of them, but please recognize that we scholars write about some things and then we write about other things. And because we write about other things doesn't mean we're not interested in what happened in Europe. And with that, I think maybe after the discussion we can continue this.
I'm not satisfied, but go ahead.
Okay.
Yeah, I had a question about sort of what was the shared vision of the Arabs or the Arabs involved in this project and the Nazis? Sort of what did they imagine for the future? Where would the Arabs fit into the sort of the grand scheme of the Germans, the new order?
Well, fortunately, this is a hypothetical issue.
Yeah.
And all I can tell you is what they said at the time. They may have been lying through their teeth, but this is what they said at the time. They said people misunderstand Nazism. They think that National Socialism is an ideology that declares that the Aryans are superior to everyone else in the world. Actually, what Nazism is about is that the world is composed of different races, and that these races should not sleep with each other. They shouldn't have sex with each other. They should just remain pure and not contaminated by one another. That's not necessarily to say that one is better than the other, and that's how we feel about the Arabs and the Muslims. That they have a great, wonderful civilization, and lo and behold, they share many values with us. And then, so then there would be this way of interpreting Islam as being anti-modern, illiberal, authoritarian, focused on community, anti-democratic, all of these things that they found to be similar to what they were about. Now, if they had in fact won the war in the Middle East, how would they really have treated the Arabs and the Muslims? This is a hypothetical issue. But the issue that I'm raising, it's a broader issue about collaboration and allies allies in the Second World War. How, if the Nazis and the Japanese had won the Second World War, would they get along with each other? You know? Would they just say, oh yes, the Japanese are superior to the peoples of Asia, but they're equal to the Germans? Or the Germans would have said, no, we're superior to everybody? Would they have found a way of getting along? What about the Germans' relationship to the Ukrainians or the Allies? So this general, it's a paradox. How can a racist government find collaboration? It's easy for communists to find collaboration. We're all, you know, part of the international proletariat or whatever. But that leap across particularism, that leap beyond the racial abyss in the mid-30s was their effort. You can say it was a cynical effort on the part of clever diplomats who were trying to gain allies among the Arabs, but there clearly were Arabs and radicalized Muslims who found it somehow compelling. And more than that, I should have said this. What they introduced into the Middle East was something modern. Husseini anti-Semitism was primordial and very old, but it wasn't yet an interpretive framework of modern politics. And that's what the Nazis brought. You want to understand the Second World War? This is why it's happening. In fact, the Second World War was started by Chaim Weizmann, and the reason he started it was to establish the State of Israel. And so then, in 1948, when the State of Israel was founded, Al-Banna and Husseini would say, you see, Hitler was right. The Allies won the war, now there's Israel. So that interpretive framework is something that I don't think was, as far as I can tell, that was not elaborated in the traditions of Islam. That was a distinctive contribution.
Just about to ask about the scriptural basis in the Quran for anti-Semitism. What does the Quran say? You mentioned in the beginning that the Quran and its interpretation presents a basis for anti-Semitism. What does it say in the Quran?
The Quran. How many of you have read the Quran? Yeah. I mean, I always ask this question. This is in 2009, like 8 years after 9/11, and invariably, almost nobody has read the Quran. Please do. Now, I don't know how any of us would react to first reading the Torah or the New Testament as adults. I just don't know what that experience would be like. The Quran, like these other major religious texts, can be read in different ways. But there are passages in the Quran that were selected out by Husseini, by Said Qutb, which express enmity toward the Jews, which express frustration that they didn't agree with Muhammad in Medina, that they would convert to Islam, and these passages are then selected and accentuated in the tradition of fundamentalist Islam or radical Islam. The Nazis didn't refer to radical Islam or fundamentalist Islam; they just referred to Islam. That's what it is.
But the idea that Hitler was a messenger from Muhammad, does that have any scriptural basis?
No, of course not. No, that's a purely modern fiction. I mean, but it's what the insertion into the commentaries on the Quran was that in Islam, in the folk wisdom of Islam, there is a tale about Allah sending a messenger to punish the Jews, and so the Germans said, well, now this has happened in our time, and that messenger is Hitler. So again, Raymond Williams, you recall, in one of his earlier works, referred to the labor of selective tradition. And that's what intellectuals do. They take traditions, they select out of them. This is what we call the history of reception. And the way that the Nazis read Islam was to select and accentuate particular components that were compatible with their views. And it's pointless, it's silly, it's futile to say that this has nothing to do with Islam. Just as it would be pointless to say that Nazi anti-Semitism had nothing to do with Christianity. But it's the selectivity and the reception and the accentuation that, in both cases, that's an issue.
No, but it's just, I just was wondering if there was an analog to, say, the Christian Gospels where you can find chapter and verse, where it says this and that, or Jesus.
Well, you could read Luther's on the Jews and their lies and say, there you go, see? But Luther also, in other words, Luther is an ambiguous figure. His anti-Semitism was not ambiguous, but he also, has there are other messages in Lutheranism. So these are huge, great traditions. These are big traditions, and the success of the impact of Nazism in the Middle East had a great deal to do with their ability to connect to another great tradition, another great cultural tradition, or parts of it.
Any other questions? Okay, so on behalf of ISA.
Those to ask, because I'm not gonna get the answer anyway, so I'll stop it.
Thank you. So on behalf of ISA, it was really an honor